Heidi by Johanna Spyri, Chapter 19, Peter Surprises Everyone. The next day Peter went to school and arrived punctually, bringing his midday meal with him in his little satchel. The Dorfley children went home in the middle of the day for dinner, but those who lived too far away used to sit on the desks with their feet on the benches, holding what they had brought with them on their laps. Afterwards they could do what they liked until 1 o'clock, when lessons started again. Peter always went over to Uncle Alms to see Heidi after he'd been to school, and that day she had been looking forward eagerly for him to come, and ran to see him as soon as he came inside the door. "I've thought of something," she cried in great excitement. "What?" he asked. "You must learn to read." "I have learned," Peter replied. "I mean learn properly, so you can read anything," she insisted. "Can't be done," Peter replied promptly. "I don't believe that anymore," she told him squarely, "and nor does anyone else. Clara's grandmama told me it wasn't so, and she was right." Peter looked rather taken aback at the Frankfurt lady being brought into it. "I'll teach you," Heidi went on. "I know how. Then you can read a hymn to Granny every day." "Not me," growled Peter. This refusal to help her carry out the plan on which she had set her heart annoyed Heidi. Her black eyes flashed, and she said threateningly, "I'll tell you what will happen if you won't learn. You'll have to go to Frankfurt like your mother said, and I know what the school there is like. Clara pointed out the great big building one day when we went out for a drive, and the boys stay there until they've grown up. I've seen them myself, and you needn't expect just one kind of teacher there like we have here. There are lots of teachers, all dressed in black as if they're going to church, and they all wear tall black hats like this," and she measured the height from the ground with her hand. Peter thought as though a cold wind had blown down his back. "You'd be there with all those gentlemen," she continued, quite carried away, "and when it came to your turn, you wouldn't be able to read, nor would you even say your letters properly. Then they'd all make fun of you, and that would be worse than Tinette, and she was bad enough." "Oh, all right, I'll do it," said Peter grumpily. At once Heidi was all smiles again. "That's good. We'll start at once." She pulled him over to the table, on which a book lay ready. It was a rhyming ABC, which had come in the big parcel from Clara. Heidi liked it very much, and thought it was just the thing for teaching Peter. They sat down side by side, bent their heads over the book, and the lesson began. Peter had to spell out the first rhyme over and over again, for Heidi was determined he should know it thoroughly. "You still don't get it right," she said after some time. "I'll read it all through to you. If you know what it says, perhaps you'll find it easier." And she read out, "If ABC you do not know, before the judge you'll have to go." "I won't go," mumbled Peter. "Won't go where?" "Before the judge." "Then hurry up and learn those letters, so that you don't have to," Heidi urged. So Peter set to and repeated them until she was satisfied. She saw what an effect the little rhyme had had on him, and thought it would be a good idea to prepare the way for the next lesson. "Wait a minute," she said, "and I'll read you the rest of the rhymes. Then you'll know what to expect. If DEF you cannot say, bad luck is sure to come your way. If you forget your HJK, you'll have misfortune all the day. If L and M you can't say clear, you'll have to pay a fine, I fear. Trouble will be in store for you if you can't say NOPQ. If you get stuck at RST, a dunce's cap your lot will be." Peter was listening so quietly that she stopped to look at him and found him staring at her with dismay, bewildered by all these threats of trouble. Heidi's tender heart melted at the sight of him, and she hastened to reassure him. "Don't worry. Just come every evening, and if you go on as you've done today, you'll soon know all your letters, and then nothing will happen to you. But you must come every day, and not stay away as you do from school. Even if it's snowing, it won't hurt you to come." Peter promised, for Heidi's picture of the school at Frankfurt had taken the fright out of him. After that, he did what Heidi told him and came regularly for his lessons, and soon made quite good progress with his letters, though he always found it difficult to learn the rhymes by heart. Uncle Elm often sat in the room with them, smoking his pipe and listening to the letters, much amused by all that went on. After his exertions, Peter was usually invited to stay for supper, which quite made up for all he went through. At length they reached the letter U, and Heidi read, If you confuse a V with U, you'll find yourself in Timbuktu. No, I won't, growled Peter, but he made haste to learn the letters all the same, if he was afraid someone might carry him off by the scruff of his neck. Next evening, Heidi read, "If over W you fall, beware the rod upon the wall." Peter glanced the room and said scornfully, "Isn't one?" "No, but do you know what grandfather has in the cupboard?" she asked. "A stick almost as thick as my arm. You can just pretend that's hanging on the wall when you say this rhyme." Peter knew Uncle Alm's stout hazel stick, and he bent over his book again at once, determined to master W. The next day the rhyme went, "If letter X you can't recall, you'll get no food today at all." Peter looked towards the cupboard where the bread and cheese were kept and remarked crossly, "I never said I was going to forget X." "Good. Then we can learn another letter at once, and there'll only be one left for tomorrow." Peter was not keen on learning any more that day, but Heidi had already begun. "If you find Y is hard to say, they'll laugh at you at school today." Peter remembered about the gentlemen in Frankfurt with their tall black hats and made himself study Y until he knew it with his eyes shut. When he came again, he was inclined to be cocky, knowing he had only one more letter to learn. As usual, Heidi read the couplet aloud. "If Z should tie you up in knots, they'll send you to the Hottentots." "Nobody knows where they live," he commented scornfully. "Grandfather will know," Heidi returned quickly. "And I'll just run and ask him. He's over with the pastor." She jumped up and was really starting off when Peter caught hold of her. "No, wait!" he cried, for he could quite see Uncle Alm and the pastor coming over together to pack him up off to the Hottentots forthwith. And he had not yet learned Z. Of course, Heidi stopped then. "What's the matter?" she asked. "Nothing. Come back, I'll learn it," he muttered. But Heidi was now eager on her own account to know where the Hottentots lived, and said again she must run and ask grandfather about it. It was only when she saw that Peter was really worried that she gave up and came back to the table. She made Peter pay for it, though, by repeating the letter Z till she felt sure he would never forget it. And then she started immediately to teach him to read whole words, which was a great step forward. It was just about this time that it began snowing again, and continued for several days, so that the ground was covered with soft snow once more, and Heidi could not get up to Granny's. For nearly 3 weeks she didn't see her, and that made her all the more anxious for Peter to be able to read to Granny in her place. Sure enough, one evening he came up from Dorfley and announced to his mother, "I can do it." "Do what, Peter?" she asked. "Read." "Can you really?" "Do you hear that, Granny?" exclaimed Bridget. Granny had indeed heard, and was wondering how it could possibly come about. "I am to read a hymn to you now," he said. "Heidi told me to." His mother fetched the book, and Granny composed herself to listen. Peter sat down at the table and really began to read. At the end of each verse his mother exclaimed, "Well, would you believe it?" Granny did not speak, but listened closely. At school in the village next day, Peter's class had a reading lesson as usual, and when it came to his turn, the teacher said, "I suppose we must pass you over again, Peter, or will you just try, not perhaps to read, but just to pick out a word or two?" Peter took the book and read 3 lines without a mistake. The teacher stared at him in silent amazement. Finally he said, "Is this a miracle? I have spent hours, weeks, years trying to teach you, and you've never been able to say your letters. Now, when I've practically given you up as hopeless, and suddenly you get up and read quite fluently. How did this come to pass?" "It was Heidi," Peter replied. The teacher glanced across at Heidi, sitting quietly in her place and looking very innocent. "Well, I have noticed a great improvement in you lately, Peter. You used to stay away from school for weeks on end. Now you never miss a day. Who was responsible for that?" "Uncle Alm," was the answer. This surprised the teacher even more. "Just let me hear you read again," he said cautiously. And Peter continued for another 3 lines. There was no mistake about it. He could read. As soon as school was over, the teacher went across to the pastor to tell him the news, and they talked about the good influence that Heidi and her grandfather were having in the village. After that, when he got home each evening, Peter read out one hymn aloud, one only. He could not be persuaded to try a second, nor did Granny press him. It was a never-failing source of wonder to Bridget, and sometimes, after he had gone to bed, she would say to Granny, "Now Peter has learnt to read, there's no telling what he might do." Once Granny replied to her, "Yes, I'm glad for his sake that he has learnt something, but I shall be quite thankful when the spring is here and Heidi can come again. They are somehow not the same hymns when Peter reads them, and I keep trying to fill in the gaps, and so I miss what comes next. So they don't do me as much good as when Heidi reads them." The truth was that Peter had made things as easy as possible for himself. When he came to a difficult word, he just left it out, thinking that a few less words among so many would make no difference to Granny. Consequently, there was sometimes little sense in what he read.